But working at a great paper like the Times is a really thrilling experience. For one thing, you're really working with really dedicated people. And I loved writing about business, and I still do, because you learn how things work that you didn't know before, and you can say the truth. I always find it, if you do movie star profiles or whatever, you're never going to really find out the whole story. But what some people on the outside may or may not know is that it's a business where there's an enormous amount of tension, because there's inevitable tension between what you see and what the people that you're interviewing want to sell you. In effect, you can't necessarily buy what they're selling. They're selling their version of history, and you have to write what you think is the real version of history. So that can be extremely tense. And I'll give you some examples from my experience that I think are kind of fun. There was a timing before it was merged, own Time Magazine and Fortune and I can't remember, Life and all. And the company was having a terrible time the year I went to see the chairman, who was then a very sweet man named Dick Monroe. And we sat there, and I had my little tape recorder, and he kept telling me how wonderful everything was. And I kept saying, yes, but your earnings are going down, and your write-offs are going up, and it's getting, and he just wouldn't cave. And finally, at the end, I said, well, it's really not very good. He said, well, I guess I could say we've been humbled. So when I went back to write the story, I used that as a lead. I used the word hubris, and then I said, Mr. Monroe concedes that the company has been humbled. Well, the story ran, and the company was really distraught. For one thing, you have to think of CEOs as generals. He was leading these troops, and basically he had said to his troops, we've messed up. So internally it was a problem, and externally it was a problem because people who owned the stock thought, they don't know what they're doing. So they tried to get me to, they called up and they're like, he never said that, you made that quote up. And fortunately I had it on tape, but it was a very important moment because it told the public that the company didn't know where it was going. And in fact, subsequently it merged with Warner and then was merged again, and he was pushed out. But they really fought it very hard. And now, another story, which is really my favorite, is more personal. I went to interview a man who ran a cable company. His name is Leo Hendry. And I go down to Washington, and I do this long interview, and I said, well, tell me about your background, Mr. Hendry. So he tells me this story, and he's like, and I grew up so poor that I had to walk to school, and we had no money, and the only present my mother ever gave me was a belt, and it didn't even fit me, because she didn't have the money to buy a belt that was the right size. So I come back to my computer, and I start writing this story, and I say to my editor, isn't this amazing? Look what this man has overcome to become CEO of the company. And she leans over and she says to me, call his mother. So I call his mother, and his mother says to me, that Leo, he tells everybody that it's ridiculous. We're middle-class people. What does he mean? I gave him cashmere sweaters. And she goes on and on. And I think to myself, well, one of the two of them is nuts, but I'm not sure who. And it was Friday morning, and this piece was going to run on Sunday. So I said to my then editor, what am I going to do? I mean, I don't know. She's nuts or he's nuts. Somebody's nuts. And she said, and I found his brother who ran the law school at Stanford. And he said, yes, Leo makes these stories up. So I called Leo back and I said, we really have to run this because you're CEO of a public company and you've kind of missed it. And he was so beside himself that we were going to run it. And the reason I decided we had to run it, even though it was a personal anecdote, is he's a professional. He's not a civilian. Once you interview civilians, they might get intimidated. They might make stuff up to show off. They don't know, But this was a pro. He'd been interviewed a lot. And this was how he treated reality. I thought people ought to know that. And so we published it, and sure enough, people started calling me out of the woodwork. We've had problems with Leo. He makes stuff up. So, you make those decisions in journalism about what needs to be in the paper and what doesn't. And there are things that don't. But in this case, we felt it was really important because it told you about the character of a man leading a public company. Well, somebody called me and they said, you really ought to look at this guy, Barry Diller's compensation. He's a man who ran a big internet company called Interactive Media, which is a bunch of stuff. I don't know what's in it. It's kind of like a vegetable soup of companies. It's a little insane. In any case, so I go and look, and sure enough, he hadn't filed his proxy when everybody else did, so he wasn't on the lists. But if you went and looked at the proxy, it turned out that in this company, he'd earned $173 million. And he was by far the highest paid executive, but that's not all. He'd spun off a division of that company into another public company that he also ran, where he also got compensation, and he was paid close to $500 million in 1 year. Well, it's more complicated than that, but in any case, clearly he didn't want that in the paper, but that's really, I think stories like that are very important to tell both investors and the public about how American companies are run, because the stock in both companies had gone down that year. So while investors had done terribly, the people running the company had made a fortune. And having now worked in journalism for a very long time and being very much aware of what's on the web, I certainly hope that people will continue to work in print journalism, because I just think the most authoritative and informed analysis of current events is pretty much found in print and to some degree television journalism. If you look at what's gone on in the current market debacle, I think the most informative analytic stories are what the Times and the Journal have done. I'm pretty much awed by what the papers have turned out, and I must say I haven't seen any analysis anywhere on any blog or any website or anything that really matches that. So that's my own prejudice. I mean, I hope it happens, but for the moment, so I'm particularly pleased to be here because I know that Marquette has a very highly regarded communication school. So thank you.